Wandering Galaxy is the latest Crossroads game from Plaid Hat Games. This story-driven TTRPG deck-building hybrid has so much awesome stuff to offer, from collaborative gameplay to exciting set pieces spread out across a brand new, cohesive Galaxy setting. However, it can be a bit tricky to get this ship off the ground, so why don't we learn how to teach Wandering Galaxy? Massive thank you to Plaid Hat Games for sending me the game and sponsoring the episode. Don't forget, there's the teacher's guide that I link in the description below that summarizes the whole teaching process, so you can just enjoy the video without feeling like there's going to be a test afterwards. There will be a test afterwards, it just won't feel like there will be. If you're a regular in the hobby, you've probably been exposed to the game Dead of Winter at some point. It's everyone's favorite semi-cooperative zombie survival game with minor hidden role elements that's gone on to becoming a classic. If you thought to yourself, I don't really like this hidden role part and really just like the emergent story aspects of these games, or thought, golly gee, I wish this was in space, well then you're in luck. Wandering Galaxy is the next Crossroads game that's fully cooperative with no hidden role shenanigans required. If you've got TTRPG friends that only dabble in board games, this is a great one to introduce them to. It has all the campaign-driven, character-motivated choices you'd expect from a TTRPG, complete with character creation and simplified backstories that persist across multiple games. And it does all of that while still playing like a board game. If you're pitching it to your hobby board game friends, the light deck building elements combined with the great table presence of all the different asymmetric control panels are easily its best mechanical selling points. Captain Sonar fans are gonna go nuts when they see this one. For all your non-gaming friends, the mechanical complexity of Wandering Galaxy might be intimidating, but once you get into it, it's shockingly simple to play. I would just lean more onto the thematic elements of the game, everything from the world building to the writing, the creative and unique characters you'll meet, along with the dozens of gorgeously illustrated locations you'll get to visit along the way. I'll be honest, it really does feel like you're getting to explore this entire galaxy in this one, and that's no small feat for a board game. Want to sell anyone on giving Wandering Galaxy a shot? Here's a 30-second pitch you can use to get anyone on board for a romp around the edges of space. Ever wanted to just pack it all up, run away, live as a nomad? Well, imagine getting to do that in space! In Wandering Galaxy, we play as a ragtag group of misfits and miscreants who want to live among the stars, free from society and all its rules and regulations. There is just one small thing. We do still have a few car payments left. As such, it's on to us to take up the dangerous and more likely stupid jobs this sector of space has to offer to pay off our lightly used spaceship. Throughout the game, we'll be keeping our vessel in tip-top-ish condition and controlling the various systems of the ship to keep everything running smoothly. We'll travel from location to location, talking to characters, sneaking around, doing the jobs no one else was dumb enough to take, and balancing the whole fate of the galaxy in our paws, claws, and hands. If we play our cards right and pay off all our debt, by the end of it all, we'll be free spacers, masters of our own cosmic destiny. One of the things you'll want to grab before even getting started are enough pencils for everyone who's playing. And yes, I said pencils, not generic writing utensils. You will be erasing some things. Our first change is to when the rulebook tells you to set up the improvement skill cards. These are all charmingly labeled 007 and make up a 4-card Clank-style adventure row in the middle of the table. These cards might be a bit of a distraction right at the start, so I personally suggest leaving those cards in the box until someone actually gets to improve, which is this game's keyword for obtaining a card from that row. No one obtains a card from this row during setup, so there's some time before you'll need to pull these out of the card catalog. Each player is going to get anywhere from 1 to 3 stations that they get to control, and it's one of the most fun parts of this game. If you're following the setup in the rulebook, it'll tell you to create your characters before handing out these stations. To me, it makes a bit more sense to assign the stations that your character will be working before diving into character customization. Look, I'll prove it to you. Do you want your character to shout, "I'm giving it all she's got, Captain!" at some point? That line doesn't work if your buddy winds up getting engineering and you get, like, logistics. "I'm giving it all she's got, Captain!" Before we get into how to distribute all the different stations, let's talk about them and what they do. There are 6 different stations: operations, navigation, logistics, engineering, science, and security. Each one has its own dials and resources to manage, but each one has significantly different goals in the game itself. Originally, I gave a super detailed breakdown of each station and what they do, but this isn't a how to play video, so that's not what you're supposed to be here for. However, I kind of crushed it with the jokes in there, so if you want to see that, I'm including it as part of the secret bonus content and blooper reel that every How to Teach episode gets, which is normally exclusive to my Patreon supporters. However, since Plaid Hat is sponsoring this video, that one will be available to everyone in the description or in the thing up in the corner or at the end. You know how YouTube works. To save time, I'll summarize each one's vibe in 6 words or less. Operations, Diet Dungeon Master. This one's you. Navigation, Turn right on remnants of Aldous. Logistics! Cargo space for supplies and surprise! Engineering! Phone's at 5%. Screen's also cracked. Science! Anyone need snacks? I'm already done. Security! Lasers and tractor beams? Pew pew! Depending on your player count and the type of players, we're going to need to distribute the stations differently. We'll start in a 2-player game. For 2 players, you actually use special rules that require the use of extra sidekick characters called apprentices for each of you. These function as substitutes for the missing players in the game and work exactly like your player character with some minor caveats. For now, here's what I recommend. If you're introducing someone who's not very familiar with board games, I recommend giving them the engineering, navigation, and science boards to control. That leaves you with the operations, logistics, and security. For 3 players, I'd assign yourself the operations and logistics, the second player can have engineering and science, and the final player can have navigation and security. At 4 players, you'll do best with just taking on operations and then distribute engineering, logistics, and security boards to the other 3. Then it's a matter of preference who gets the science and navigation, as those are the 2 least demanding stations. This leads to a nice spread of complexity across all the players. With 5, you're going to assign everything but science, of which can just go to like anyone because, you know, it's the science station. Once you've gotten everyone set up with 1 or more station, it's time to actually set up the stations themselves. When first handing stations out, which will basically be the first thing you do in your teach as part of setting up, I would direct players to look at the back of their stations to see their setup guides, and also give them a little bag or tray with everything they need. Between you and me, they won't actually need to do this. This is just a sneaky way of making sure everyone is familiar with what their station does, what the components they'll be handling are called, and to make sure their dials and stuff are set to the appropriate starting values. Make them do the work. Once everyone's stations are all squared away, it's time to meet the crew. To let everyone choose their characters, what I recommend for the fastest and smoothest setup is to not pass the pad of character sheets around, but instead preemptively tear out one of each of the races and couple them with their standees in the middle of the table. This way, no one is having to deal with flipping through the pad, and there won't be any confusion or disappointment over 2 people picking the same character. Once everyone's got their character, it's time for the most fun part of any game, which is character creation. Stop! Before anyone has a chance to write anything on their character sheet, they need to know not to write in the 2 spots labeled catchphrase and nickname. It's very tempting to come up with your own, but these are mechanical parts of the game, which is kind of hilarious. People aren't going to be writing these themselves, and I say this now because every single person I've handed a character sheet immediately starts coming up with a nickname and a catchphrase, which isn't how nicknames and catchphrases work. You have to earn them. You can't come out of the gate swinging with a plucky nickname and one-liner catchphrase. Imagine if you introduced yourself with that. People would think you're weird, and we want them to think you're weird for other reasons. This game keeps character creation simple. You won't roll for stats, but instead you'll just come up with a character vibe coupled with a name and then answer some questions about them on the back of your sheet. Add up the answers like it's a teen magazine quiz to find out which backstory is right for you. And since I had you assign the stations before this, that can help players who don't usually create backstories for their characters come up with appropriate answers to their little questions. A little trick I learned from the designer of this game is that you can see what kinds of skill checks your race is particularly good at by looking at the symbols on the back of the character sheet below the race name. I'll talk about what all that means in a second, but that's just something to keep in mind for the min-max player in your life who cares more about stats than they do about backstory. Now that everyone knows who they are and what they're doing, it's time to blast off! Well, actually, it's time to go buy the ship and then get into debt. So then we can blast off! Now that we're actually past setup, here's where we set the big 3. For those unaware, I break down the beginning of every teach into setting 3 key parts so that your teach always starts off on the right foot. These are setting the stage, setting the goal, and setting the expectations. In this one, setting the stage is quite easy. We've already got our sci-fi panels and characters out, so all you really need is some ambient space music. Since this is such a narrative-heavy game, I'd actually recommend letting the player on science, the least demanding of the stations, to control the music. Depending on how extra you want them to be, you can also task them with DJing and finding and alternating between ambient space music and intense space battle music as the story evolves over time. Or you could just do it yourself if you don't trust a Nexu with the aux cord. Yeah, your ship doesn't have Bluetooth. It's a older model. Anyways. As far as the narrative hook goes, the story setup is the same as real life. Survive capitalism. So everyone reading off their backstory is more than enough to cover a lot of setting the stage, so I'd keep it short and simple and leave it at that. You'd also get a chance to set the stage more explicitly with the opening scenes of each game, which we'll talk more about later. This game has one main way to lose. Otherwise, we're just here for a good time, and probably not a long time. So for setting the goal, that's the main thing we want to establish. Here's the breakdown for you. To win, all we gotta do is make enough profit to pay off an installment of the ship we buy. Easy peasy. The ways we can die though are much greater in quantity. There are lots of trackers we'll need to keep an eye on throughout our adventure, but the one that's the most critical to never let max out is threat. Threat is the generalized form of danger in space. Anything from lingering in a shady starport to pushing our luck with the local mob boss can add threat. Too much threat, and not even our plucky can-do attitude can stand against it. Later on in the teach, we'll explain the details of how you will likely gain or lose resources, including threat, so for now, that should be a good enough explanation to get the ball rolling. For setting the expectations, this is a game that has a lot of moving parts, and it's not up to any particular player to understand how all of them work. It's best enjoyed by leaning into the narrative and doing what you think your character would do. As you learn more about the game, you can start to play more optimally, but regardless, this isn't a game you're going to play for a min-maxed character with an optimal in-meta loadout. This is a game you play to experience the story of a team of wildly incompetent space ferrets and robots. Everyone going into this needs to be aware that there will be plenty of failure, but even when you suck, there are lots of options to compensate, because even the punishments for failures in this game can be turned around into a positive. An example you can give of this are with these stress cards. These are cards that you can gain to give another player potential advantage on a skill check. These stress cards have a symbol that acts as a wild for any skill check, so this can make them more useful than a lot of the cards in your deck. Obviously, too many of these and you're going to start sustaining injuries, but a little bit of stress is totally a good thing. At least that's what my therapist says. Finally, the last expectation to set is the campaign length. Each game consists of paying off a chunk of your debt, and the campaign is made up of 4 games. It's good to work out ahead of time who all will be playing in multiple games or not. Fortunately, the game is flexible enough to account for dropping in and out and different people manning different stations, so you can let the group know that they don't have to worry too much about having to be present for all 4 games. Once we've gotten our big 3 set up, there's just one more thing we'll need to talk to everyone about before heading out into space, and that's skill checks. Skill checks are the game's main mechanic to determine the outcomes of different actions throughout the game. These are super easy to explain as well. Prompt everyone to look through their deck of cards that they were handed at setup if they haven't already yet. All you need to say is that whenever you're directed to make a skill check, draw 3 cards, do whatever they say, if anything, then add up all the relevant icons. Each skill check typically checks 2 icons, so both kinds will count towards the total. For reference, there are 4 types of symbols: mind, body, focus, and spirit, which are briefly and tinily described in the opening paragraph of the rulebook and literally nowhere else. My group inevitably started calling them brain, hand, eyeball, and sparkle. Now, there is one more symbol which are effectively wilds. They're the little planet with the +1 on it. They do exactly what you think they do, so moving on, but they typically come in the form of perk tokens. Ton of things during the game will give you these. They're a free single point one-time use bonus to any skill check you're making to help push you over a threshold. Like I mentioned in setup, you'll keep these set aside until someone actually gains one to explain what they do. There are also group skill checks, but in my time playing, I didn't really run into too many of these, so just explain how they work when they come up. A group check just requires everyone involved to make their own skill check, and half of the group rounded up needs to pass. So for example, 3-man group check, 2 people need to pass. And because it's not helpful at all to panic during a group project, no one is allowed to stress out for these. So you're on your own for the group check. On your own for the... It's finally time to start your player's first campaign. Like I said earlier, this game is driven by a free web app that has pretty much full voice acting, though I personally prefer to do all the voices myself since I'm just so good at it. At the top of every campaign, there is a little generic spiel that explains the location, the titular wandering galaxy, and then there is a short campaign introduction that you'll either have the app narrate for you or narrate yourself. While we're talking about the app, it does have a setup guide built into it that could potentially help you when you're new, which does go over all the stations if you want it to. And you might have noticed, I skipped over that fact earlier. I really recommend telling each player to just look at the back of their station to get a better feel for what their station is and how they're going to be manning it, instead of using the app for that part. Doing it this way also allows the setup of each station to be simultaneous, speeding up the process since the app can only help you set up one at a time. With all that out of the way, let's dive into how to run your first game. In the beginning campaign, it started on Riva. You're going to begin with what's called a location book round. The location book is the heart of this game, containing all the different locations and the actions you can take while there. It's also got all the different combat scenarios and submaps to larger galaxy clusters. It's genuinely freaking awesome. Not to mention that it all has gorgeous art, and oh my god, I forgot! They have stickers in this game that you get to put on your ship, and... I'm sorry, I got a little excited there. You start the game with the location book round. There are 3 phases to location book rounds: the planning phase, the action phase, and then the end of round phase. Pretty much everything in the game is based off of location book rounds, so if there is one part to nail of your teach, this is the one. In the first of the 3 phases, the planning phase, you'll explain that in turn order, everyone's going to be taking their standee and putting it on one of the options based on the title of it, along with the corresponding icons underneath. The first page of the first campaign is kind of a cluster of icons when you're not really prepared to know what all those mean. So I will put on screen a summary of these icons and what they are, which I'll be including in the teacher's guide as a reference. When you hit a new page, I tend to read out all the titles and point to the various icons for each of the actions just to make sure that everyone's in the loop when it comes to which action is which. Players looking from across the table or upside down might have a hard time reading them, so this just makes sure everyone's on the same page. The action titles and icons also tend to be vague on purpose, generally just indicating that you'll either need or gain that type of icon, so don't overthink it. If a space says shop the markets and underneath are the icons for spirit and focus next to the icon for gaining a card and supplies, you'll probably be using spirit and focus to gain a card and or supplies. When you first flip to this page, normally what the game expects you to do is to immediately start a timer for 45 seconds, which is to encourage you to not read the paragraphs on the right and just go with your gut based on the short descriptions. It also adds a little bit of tension to the decision-making process as a group. However, for some groups, and especially when you're just learning the game, that time pressure combined with having to read, comprehend, and make those kinds of decisions as the first thing you actually do as a player, yeah, that's a deal breaker for most. A good compromise I came up with is to take the rulebook and just cover the right half of the location book. This removes the temptation to try to read the nitty-gritty of what each action does without forcing you into a time limit. I would do this for your first couple location book rounds while everyone gets into the swing of gameplay. Now that we've given ourselves time to breathe, we can explain the different types of actions while on this page, which fortunately, the first location will have all of them available to us. There are 2 types of actions with 2 special action tokens that you'll occasionally put out on top of existing actions. As a base, you've got limited and unlimited actions. Only one person can choose a limited action, and through the power of context clues, you might surmise what the unlimited actions let you do. For the tokens, they come in required and locked variants. These also do exactly what you think they do, meaning someone has to or absolutely cannot take that action. One catch though, if a required action is still available by the time it goes around to the table, the last player or players have to put their standee on one of the remaining required actions. That's what required means. Look, this is just one of those mechanics that you have to explain, like no matter how obvious it is in hindsight. Like you start explaining it and you're just like, yeah, this is obvious. I know it's obvious. We just got to get through it. So to summarize your first location book round, flip open the book, cover the right half of the rulebook to give yourself a chance to explain what's going on, which includes talking about the different type of actions, then read off all the different actions and explain the different icons. Finally, go in turn order starting with you since you're on operations, and decide what you'd like to do without the timer on your first couple of rounds to decide how to get a feel for how the game works. Once everyone's comfortable with how a location book round works, you can introduce the timer back in. As for what option to choose as the teacher in this first round, I recommend going with anything but the first choice. It's the first major story beat, and leaving it open will help involve other players in the teach sooner. Now it's time to start doing the things. You've got your decisions lined up and now you get to act on them. Once everyone's placed their standees, you'll explain that you'll resolve your action selections top to bottom and basically just make your way through everyone's choices. I sometimes struggle to remember which action I'm reading from, so I used a spare card that I placed underneath the current action to keep track of which one we're resolving, not accidentally jump between actions. It's around here where you'll be able to demonstrate how skill checks work in this game. Once a player hits the first check, you'll break it down for the whole table using them as the example. Give everyone one last chance to look through their deck, and then everyone can give their deck a shuffle. Once everyone's got their deck ready, you'll walk the person making the check through the super simple process of drawing 3 cards, resolving those cards, and finally adding up all the relevant symbols. It's typical to know ahead of time what threshold you'll have to hit for a successful outcome, so before you even finish up a skill check, you'll have an idea of whether or not you'll pass or fail. Something to know when adding up their total is that each skill check comes equipped with a prompt or a one-word summary of the type of action it is. Every character gets one of these from the start, and each prompt bonus will add 1 to their total for any check that they make with the corresponding prompt. Think of it like proficiency in D&D. I would keep a close eye out for these and explain them the first time someone happens to make a skill check where they have the matching prompt, since you don't really have too much control over when you make certain types of skill checks in this game. I would let the player making the first skill check go ahead and give it their best shot without explaining anything other than the basics of drawing cards, and then perk tokens and prompts if they're relevant. If they're successful, great, proceed onwards, business as usual. Once you hit a skill check where someone's about to fail by just one icon, you can explain the concept of stressing out. Not like in real life, that'll just happen naturally. In the game, if someone's doing a skill check and isn't going to make it to a success, another player can stress out and add a stress card to their deck. Once you do, you get to roll the chance die. This has a chance to add 1 to the current skill check. It also has a 1 in 6 chance to crit, adding 2 to the skill check. It also has a 1 in 6 chance to crit fail, and add nothing to the skill check. I told you stressing out would happen in real life naturally. Now, there technically is no limit to how many times people can stress out for any particular skill check, meaning if it feels important, everyone can stress out, or just one person could stress out over and over again, like I do for everything. Again, you know the number you need to hit, and you can check the total between stressing out attempts. Just make sure everyone's aware that there is a limited number of stress cards, and once those run out, you have to start adding injuries to their characters instead. Getting injuries means you're on your way to an embarrassing early retirement. That's why I recommended only explaining stressing out when a player is short by just 1 on a skill check and not 2 or more. That way there's a 5 out of 6 chance they successfully manage to turn a failure into a success. This way, the first time they use this mechanic, it's more than likely to end in success and encourage further usage, rather than ending in failure and becoming a forgotten mechanic, or with someone burning up all the stress cards on a check for something stupid like a dance-off. Actually, that's pretty important. Bad example. On the subject of skill checks, there are some special cards that might come up from people's decks, either from their starting cards or elsewhere. These are item and sidekick cards, the quintessential adventurer accessories. These work just like normal skill cards, however, they can be equipped to your character and hang around for any skill checks afterwards, or as it's called in the game, you ready the card. This is something that you'll explain the first time someone pulls one of these types of cards. You can ready cards right when you get them too, so there's no need to draw them later. The even cooler part is, if all your slots are full and you find like a new cooler gun or whatever, you can dismiss something to make room for it, and cards that get dismissed can go to anyone's discard pile. Also, whenever you dismiss something, you could just like banish it from reality, but giving your friends your hand-me-downs is way more fun. So remember how I mentioned not to deal out the improvement row? Well, now that you've got players actually doing things, they're likely going to be instructed to improve, which means they get a fun new card to add to their deck. Once someone hits an improve reward, go ahead and set out the 4 cards in front of the improvement deck for them to pick from, explaining any particular notable cards that come up. Most of the time though, they're pretty self-explanatory though, so nothing to worry about. You might have heard me use the word banish earlier, which is this game's dramatic way to say remove from the game, which is just so extra. I love it. Especially when you consider some of these cards are representations of sidekicks. You mean it's just like banished. Removing cards in this game is super friendly. If you're told to banish a card, there's no restriction of what card you can pick from, either from your deck or your discard pile. You'll just need to shuffle your deck if you pick a card from there. Also of note, you can't banish status cards, which means you can't just banish your stress and injuries. Again, these are all things you'll explain when they become necessary, and most people who've played a deck builder before will be familiar with these concepts already. Now that you've got a handle on skill checks and resolving them, you should have hopefully made it through your first location book round. Wasn't so bad once you got going, right? After the first round or two, you'll eventually start getting the chance to take off into the expanse of the Wandering Galaxy, which basically will take you into the rest of the main gameplay loop. Finish a location book round, decide if you want to leave the current location, then either start a new location book round or travel on the map to a new space in space. However, once you have everyone in this gameplay loop of location, then travel, and then back to location, you've basically taught 90% of the mechanics in this game, so if you made it this far, just know that you're through the thick of it and there is light at the end of the tunnel. Or that might be just the light at the end of the tunnel, since you might have died by now. Sorry. Actually, sorry, no, I should reword that. You might have been promoted to corpse. Once you start traveling, you'll usually have the option to keep traveling instead of going into another location book round, depending on where you fly to. As you do this, the app will usually ask you if you want to work the ship. Every station has a small work the ship section, and this is where you'd get to pick one of your 3 options. As you're flying around, it's really tempting to work the ship every chance you get, mostly because when given an option in any game, most players will choose to do a thing rather than not do a thing. However, if you work the ship too often, then you risk putting too many threat tokens into the drawbag. The only times I would suggest the group to work the ship is if someone has a dial that's approaching the red, or there's a particular mission or story reason for why you would need to. Most of the ship's stations are codependent, relying mostly on engineering and logistics to keep the power and supplies up respectively, so I would see if you're low on power or supplies as a good baseline of whether or not you need to work the ship. Another reason to suggest to a new group when they might want to work the ship is if a lot of stations have damage tokens on them. As you draw from the bag, which I'll let you in on a little secret, it's never a good thing, and it happens all the gosh dang time, you'll get these generic damage tokens. Typically, you'll put these on a station assigned to whoever is the first player, or if you're in combat, which I'm just about to get to, don't worry, they'll get assigned based on what part of the ship took a hit. Most stations don't really care about taking damage, and most have a work the ship action to repair themselves as well, with logistics being able to repair any station with one of its work the ship actions. Obviously, the fewer of these generic damage tokens are on the draw bag, the greater the chance that what you'll draw is a worse token, so repairing these is usually a top priority. Now, I think it's time we fight some stuff. Combat in this game works almost the exact same as any other location book round. You still set a timer, you still go in turn order placing your standee on available actions, and you resolve them top to bottom. However, now it's security's time to shine. Security will now have these little blip doohickeys to keep track of. These blips are placed green side up and represent a thing you can target in space. They might be objects, friendly creatures, evil pirates, what have you. They'll be told what to place and where to place them, and security will have instructions on what to set their dials to for that specific blip. This top-down view can get a little disorienting when combined with the pretty pictures, so always remind people of what each token is as you go through combat. You'll also need to mention that their positions matter. Turns out you have to aim guns. Security's weapons and equipment all aim to specific spaces, and it's important that targets are appropriately lined up before firing. Every combat page has a pilot action, which translates to moving all of the tokens clockwise or counterclockwise around the ship. On really high successes, this can even let you completely reorganize where the blip tokens are. Piloting usually comes before every other action, so if there ever is a time to stress out about a skill check, it's probably during these pilot checks to make sure that everyone else has any weapons or equipment lined up for their turns. Also of note, if it's on the location book, anyone can use the action. Just because it says fire weapons doesn't mean they have to specifically be assigned to the security station. Combat locations tend to have you loop at that location over and over again until some criteria is met. Typically, one or more of security's dials hitting 0, which usually represents something being destroyed or placated. At the end of each combat round, the app will typically gather information about each of the dials to see what happens next. If you want things to keep running smoothly at the table, you'll want to make sure whoever's on security is particularly paying attention. Otherwise, that can really halt the progress of these combat locations. Combat, skill checks, location rounds. I think that covers it. Once you've gotten through your first combat round, there's pretty much nothing the game can throw at you to slow you down. Oh, okay, well, it can still, throw things at you, but, so could anyone, see? You just, yeah. The point is, you're ready to bring some freshies into the wondrous world of Wandering Galaxy. Oh, hey, it's the Teacher's Guide. There's a link to my Patreon where anyone can download it for free, and then you can just keep it on your phone or print it out and leave it in the box for the next time you want to romp around the Wandering Galaxy with new players. Again, huge thank you to Plaid Hat Games for sponsoring this episode. I seriously can't thank them enough. They have been awesome to work with. Wandering Galaxy launches at PAX Unplugged this year, so definitely swing by their booth to check it out now that you know how to teach it to your friends. And don't forget, it's thanks to them that you've got access to the blooper reel and bonus content, so that's on their conscience now. Aside from saying smash that subscribe button, I'm pretty sure I've said all the YouTube things, so thank you for watching. Now go, explore space, and find your cosmic destiny! Or die trying!